Heinrich Heine was not well. In May of 1848, the German Jewish writer, known for his lyric poetry set to music by such composers as Schumann and Schubert, suddenly fell paralyzed. Heine would never recover. Further musings were confined to bed, a pulpit for the pen which he dubbed his mattress grave, where a cruel malady of the spine plagued him for the remaining 8 years of his life. During this final tenure, and even long before, the author confessed to his all-consuming love affair with marble statues and dead women, the greatest of which was discovered in 1820, some 3 decades earlier, on the Greek island of Melos in the Aegean. It was Olivier Voiture, a 23-year-old ensign in the French Navy, who witnessed the unexpected unearthing of Aphrodite by a farmer attempting to remove rocks from his field. The farmer apparently found absolutely no beauty in the goddess, either in classical or contemporary terms. Voiture had to pay him not to rebury her. Aphrodite, known here as Venus of Milo, quickly fell into the hands of Marcos de Rivière, French ambassador to the sublime port of the Ottoman Empire, who presented it to Louis XVIII. In turn, the King of France donated the marble goddess to the Louvre the following year. This masterwork of the late Hellenistic era, once adorned with succulent jewelry, won instant fame. Standing before her in the Louvre, one couldn't help but speculate at her missing arms, which may have at one time held an apple, a crown, or a mirror by which she admired her reflection, and be all the more drawn to her. Perhaps it was that, her divine mystery, counterbalanced by her association with eroticism and beauty, as her half-nakedness testified to, her sensual feminine curves and inviting drapery, which effortlessly clapped the eyes of countless souls upon her. Or as Gregory Curtis, author of Disarmed, the story of Venus de Milo, put it, the statue is beautiful in a way that even an untrained eye immediately understands. It was there in the Louvre where Heinrich Heine, so enraptured with her beauty, held private talks with the divine being. For Heine, Venus was the most blessed of goddesses arising from the ancient pantheon. She could promise the erotic pleasures as a radiant seductress, or the domesticated charms of a loving and caring housewife. In other words, he saw her everywhere, first and foremost through his many loves, dead and living, and was, without question, his literary muse. As the butterfly flutters round a flower, he wrote, so my soul always fluttered round her rosy lips. Despite the ongoing conflict between the ancient pagan and the Christian world, Homer, Virgil, and Ovid were largely unharmed by the church, perhaps because Rome itself was Hellenized. In Heine's writings, however, the Pope of Rome would grant no forgiveness of sin for his unrepentant adoration of Venus. She was the devil, he wrote, adorned with beautiful claws. It was in the Louvre where, upon visiting Venus one final and momentous time, Heine burst into tears. On the night of his own death, the troubled words which spilled from Heine's pen recounted a rather recent dream. Heine described a dead man. Specific to his disturbances, he was the man. The poet saw himself lying in an open sarcophagus, the kind one might find in a museum associated with Egypt, Greece, or Rome, and surrounded by shards of broken sculpture. This particular funeral receptacle, however, was clearly Hellenized, as it was decorated with scenes depicting both classical mythology and the Hebrew Old Testament. Suddenly, and perhaps not so quite out of the ordinary, when one stops to ponder his frequented conversations with Stone, bitter and quarrelsome voices broke his silence of rest. To this effect, Heinrich wrote, "Oh, the argument will never end. Always will truth quarrel with beauty. The human host will always split in two halves, Greeks and the barbarians." His poem, titled For Mooch, would prove his last. 28 years later, after Madame Hein's own passing, his dear friend Camille Selden recounted another troublesome irregularity surrounding his death. On that Sunday, February 17th, 1856, she wrote, "I had a strange waking. As the 8 o'clock hour dawned, she heard a noise in her room, a sort of fluttering such as that produced on summer evenings by the wings of nocturnal butterflies which come in through the open window and search desperately for an exit. She then opened her eyes, but just as suddenly closed them, for in the first glimmering of day, a black form was writhing like a gigantic insect and seeking some way of escape. Despite the winter cold, Madame Selden hastened through Parisian streets to his home. But the poet who had intimately named her Mooch was already dead. He had passed, she said, recounting her terrible waking vision of the tormented spirit, somewhere between 5 and 8 o'clock in the morning. The man responsible for translating the bulk of Hebrew scripture into the Latin text we know today as the Vulgate never could erase the guilt of his lifelong love affair with Virgil, Plato, Cicero, and Homer. Like the sarcophagus of Heine's dream some 1,500 years later, Jerome was unquestionably Hellenized. The church father was simply unwilling to abandon his great library in Rome, which he had slavishly collected book by book with great care and toil. His guilt would bring on dedicated fasts, but only, he confessed to a friend, that I might afterwards read Cicero, after many nights spent in vigil, after floods of tears called from my inmost heart, after the recollection of my past sins, I would once more take up Plautus. He quickly added, and when at times I returned to my right mind and began to read the prophets, their style seemed rude and repellent. He was offended by the stylistic impoliteness of the early Christian writings, the way the Hebrew language rolled off the tongue, and had it not been for the encouragement of his teacher, he would have abandoned his study of the book of Daniel completely, as the Bible's greatest prophetic offering simply paled in comparison to Quintilian and Cicero. In short, truth could never compete with the beauty of the pagan. One might say Jerome was a human host split in two halves, and yet he pondered of himself, what agreement have Christ and Belial? What has Horace in common with the Psalter, Virgil with the Gospels, Cicero with the Apostle? According to his same letter, Jerome was on the eastward path for Jerusalem when, quite suddenly, he was caught up in the Spirit and dragged before the judgment seat of God. The light surrounding him was so bright, and those who stood around him so radiant, that he cast himself upon the ground, daring never to look up. A voice then asked him, who he was. To this Jerome replied, "I am a Christian." "Thou liest," cried the voice. "Thou art a follower of Cicero, not of Christ. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." It was his Saul on the road to Damascus moment. As one would expect of such comparisons, his life would likewise never be the same. Or so he promised the judge at the time. "If ever again I possess worldly books," he vowed, "or if ever again I read such, I have denied thee." Jerome assured his readers as to the graveness of his encounter. This was no sleep, nor idle dream. His friends would hold him to it. Regardless, his was a promise impossible to keep. The images of his former lovers had remained as furniture pieces neatly arranged in his mind. Those memories would prod at him, knock upon his better senses, muddle clarity, and ultimately reel him in. Essentially, powers beyond him beckoned, and Jerome, weary of the fight, would change his oath before God within 15 years of the vision. Rather than denying the Lord by settling into a pagan page-turner, as he had once surmised, he agreed to read the books of God with a zeal greater than he had previously given to the books of men. For Jerome, it became a necessary compromise. So legendary were Jerome's insistences to bleed pagan verse into Christian literature that his one-time friend Tyrannus Rufinus, the two had studied together in Rome, not merely satisfied as his strongest intellectual and confrontational opponents, became intent rather on persecuting him. Jerome was not only accused of instructing a monk in Bethlehem to copy dialogues of Cicero, but of teaching the classics to his pupils. And in a letter to the monk Pamicius, Jerome openly insisted that one could study secular wisdom, provided the reprehensible was met with discretion. The Roman orator Magnus sought to inquire why Jerome insisted in making use of ancient pagans in his ecclesiastic work, thereby contaminating the sacred with the profane. Though Jerome insisted to his critics that he had not read the profane authors since his school days, he did admit to reading them with an air of enjoyment, adding with the spice rack of nostalgia, "Must I then drink the waters of Lethe that I may forget?" In defending himself, rather ironically, the first figure which occurred to him was not taken from the truth of Scripture, but the beauty of mythology. For Jerome, profane literature was a captive of Christ, and could therefore be enjoyed. But to what end? Well, for starters, that dream, he insisted, was probably misinterpreted for overzealousness, and was after all a dream, and only a dream. His was a generation which pronounced such severe blows against paganism, notably the destruction of the temple at Serapis at Alexandria, and the worldwide prohibition of pagan worship in 392, that his willful abstinence from works directed against the occult faith is telling. Perhaps, to be fair, he was unwilling to go along with the mob, unafraid to cross a picket line. Lack of team spirit would certainly arouse suspicion. Or perhaps he was simply more honest about his hypocrisy, even if lame intellect attempted to distract from the compromise. Despite the surface level turning of tables across the Mediterranean, from the Senate floor in Rome to the streets of Alexandria, compromises were had, dire compromises. The pagan religion simply exchanged the image of a mother goddess with child for a blessed mother with child. The illustrious world of Homer and the ideas embodied by Plato would remain. Finally hidden in plain sight, the beauty of paganism could and would thrive. To target the few loudmouth compromisers like Jerome, willing to publicize his own love of beauty over truth, would be unfair to the universal hush of the human heart in his generation and our own. Today we are faced with the same charges. Are we not also charmed by Apollo's muses? If we were the protagonists of Jerome's dream, what name might the voice accuse us of following? If our extracurricular lovers were to blanket our souls in death, what illustrations might engrave the sarcophagus of our intended rest? If our minds were a museum, the Louvre, if you will, what sort of furniture, artifacts of antiquity, human masterpieces, marble gods, more precisely, how much barren truth would fill its floors and ceilings in proportion to beauty? Whose eternal inheritance would our museum give testimony to? To the tomb of the crucified Christ? Or the all-consuming fire prepared for Satan and his angels? For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Perhaps Jerome's vision, or was it simply a dream, was not for him alone.